Let's talk about YouTube in terms of like choke points there.
Yeah, well, YouTube, is an example of how going to sleep on antitrust law for 40 years allowed companies to grow not by being great, but by being rich. So Google is a company that has only made three successful products, right? They made a really good search engine, a pretty good Hotmail clone, and a browser that's great to use, except that it spies on you like crazy. And everything else that they tried to build in-house failed, including things like Google Video. And all their successes, including their whole mobile stack, their ad tech stack, their server management tools, all of it are companies that they bought from someone else, including YouTube, which is a service that they couldn't compete with, and so they bought. As Mark Zuckerberg notoriously once said in a memo that has come back to haunt him, it is better to buy than to compete. And YouTube has got this incredible lock-in as well. It has the same kind of aggregated audience that it gets by self-preferencing within the Google ecosystem. So, Google puts YouTube links at the top of its search results and so on. And it also has a lock on the advertising market. Google and Facebook together control about 80% of the display advertising and search advertising market. And they've rigged that market. The Texas Attorney General case against Facebook includes against Google, includes the publication of the infamous Jedi Blue memos, where Google and Facebook got together to rig the ad market, which means it's very hard to sell ads or buy ads without buying them from them, and they skim off 50% or more once all the fees and so on are calculated in. So if you're a creator, you really have to be on YouTube. It's very hard to be anywhere else. And in the early days of YouTube, the studios and the labels really went nuts on YouTube and sued them like crazy in lots of different ways. The most notorious one was a Viacom lawsuit where they were seeking to put YouTube out of business and then assimilate it as a division of Viacom. There were a bunch of internal emails published as part of that lawsuit where all these little Prince links within Viacom were arguing among themselves about which one would get to run YouTube once they'd broken its back. And as a consequence of these copyright cases that were brought against YouTube, YouTube voluntarily introduced this thing called Content ID, where anyone can upload, anyone who's in the service can upload a clip and say, this is my copyrighted work, and if you hear or see anything that looks like this being uploaded into YouTube, I get to control it. I get to decide whether it can be published at all, and if it is, I get to take all the money that's generated from its production. And there are lots of ways that this has come to harm artists. So you have some artists who invest a lot of money in producing videos on YouTube, only to have unscrupulous third parties come along and file fake copy strikes against them. And if you get 3 copy strikes against your account, it's terminated forever. And so these guys will file 2 fake copy strikes against an artist and then come back at them and say, if you don't want that third to hit, then you're going to have to pay me ransom. You're going to have to pay me a share of your income. And as we know, you're never going to reach anyone who's a live human being at YouTube to actually sort this out. There have been a couple of high-profile cases where YouTube caught these guys, but you have to imagine that there were lots where they didn't. Much more above board and well understood is what happens to classical musicians. So if you're a classical musician, you're performing compositions that are long out of copyright, hundreds of years old, and the definitive recordings of most of those belong to one of the big 3 record labels, Sony. So 70% of all the recordings in the world are owned by Sony, BMG, and Universal. And they got those not by investing in them, but by buying up other labels at fire sale prices during various economic downturns. And Sony has put Content ID strikes up for all of the classical performances of all the classical music. And if you're a pianist at home on lockdown, as many were, or a musician at home on lockdown, and uploading recordings and hoping to monetize them through your Patreon or through an ad or through selling music lessons or what have you, you would find that your music was being taken down and that you were getting copy strikes or being demonetized and your money was being harvested by Sony, which managed to claim effectively a kind of pseudo copyright over every performance of these public domain recordings. You could contest their claims, their automated claims, but Sony would often come back and say, no, this is really our copyright and we insist that you YouTube demonetize it or take it down.
And to be clear, there's no validity to that claim. It is just brute force at that point by the copyright holder of a different performance.
Yeah, that's right. It's basically that, if you are someone who knows senior executives within Google, you can get stuff done. And you will often see this happen on social media. Back when Twitter worked, you would often see people who had high-profile accounts being petitioned by their fans to say, hey, I'm a small-time classical pianist. My music was taken down by Sony. No one at YouTube will listen to me. You've got a much bigger account. Will you retweet this? Or, I know you, I saw you once did a talk at Google. Could you email the person who booked you in and see if they would forward a complaint to someone at YouTube so it'll be looked at by a human being? And whereas if you're Sony, you've just got like a person whose phone number you have at YouTube. And so you can solve your problems with a call.
I will say this, that when at one point we were getting, like when we would do the show, we kept getting copyright strikes on YouTube from, I think it was AP UK or Reuters UK. And it was for stuff that like, we got this from C-SPAN. We got this, like, this is not where, and we didn't have, like, now we have like a representative that I can email and say, hey, why did we get this copyright strike? Sometimes it's because we've said stuff that is, we don't get copyright strikes that much anymore, to be honest with you. But that changed. And that's just because we got, at one point 1 million subscribers, and when we got the guy, and your average person doesn't have the opportunity for this at all. But isn't part of this also a function of these, particularly like Facebook and YouTube, not wanting to spend money on actual content moderation, and it's just all based on like sort of like they're trying to save money? Well, I'm saying in terms of like the way that these things get that broken. I mean, I know there's other aspects to this, but in this specific instance, there's just no people working there to do this because they don't want to pay for those people.
So it's definitely the case that if they paid more people to investigate these moderation claims, that more of these moderation claims will get cleared. But I'm skeptical that a meaningful number of them could get cleared. I think that if you hired every copyright lawyer who was ever born or whoever will be born, that you would still not be able to adjudicate every copyright question that arises out of these giant platforms. The problem isn't just that they're understaffed. It's just like the problem with, say, Facebook is not that they have an insufficient number of people to kind of go through the 3-ring binder in which they've expressed the policy for moderating the conversations of 3 billion people speaking 1,000 languages in 100 countries. The problem is that there isn't a binder thick enough or a workforce large enough to make sense of that project. It's a fool's errand. And by allowing all of the video to get aggregated into this one platform, which is not a market function, it's not that YouTube was the best, it was that YouTube was the company that was bought by the company that could leverage its search dominance and its ad dominance and its other forms of dominance like mobile to become the dominant video platform, now only to be challenged by TikTok, which has its own set of unfair competitive advantages, most notably the fortunes and power of the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese Communist Party, that it was able to get this dominant position such that its failings become so important. As people start to rethink whether they want to be on Twitter, the problem of Twitter is coming into much sharper focus, which is not merely that Twitter made mistakes in how it moderated its content, but also that if you didn't want to put up with those mistakes and you quit Twitter, you quit something that mattered a lot, right? It became the one conversation that mattered a lot to a lot of people, for emotional support, for news, for access to emergency services, for conversations with people they love, or for an audience, for a creative laborer. And what that meant was that those mistakes mattered in an enormous way. And just like when we allow our country to dwindle to 4 airlines, and then one of them turns out to be Southwest Airlines during Christmas week, and they cancel thousands and thousands of flights, that is a huge problem in a way that it wouldn't be if we still had 25 airlines.
Right.
And Southwests were just around the margin. For one thing, when Southwest started to cancel all those flights, American Airlines was able to start charging $10,000 or more for one-way tickets that were domestic coach, because there was so many people who were scrambling to get on, and it had all that pricing power. So, one way to make companies less harmful is to take away their power to do harm. and not just to make them work well, but to make them fail gracefully. And graceful failure means that you just can't be that important, right? It's that by allowing these companies to amass these monopolies, we allowed them to become so structurally important and so unmanageable that it was inevitable that they would fail and that those failings would be very consequential.
Right. I mean, that has always been my sort of take on Twitter, is that the issue is they shouldn't be a town square. there
Right.
shouldn't be a town square that is privately owned. I'm not sure how you would go about having the government own it per se, but certainly if we can't come up with a scheme for some type of Twitter co-op, there's no way that it should be big enough that it's the town square. I mean, that's the problem. We should be able to go.
I mean,
on.
I think that's what Mastodon is attempting, not a publicly owned Twitter, but a Twitter replacement whose ownership is spread out among lots and lots of entities, including some government entities. There are local governments already setting up their own Mastodon instances. So, you don't have to have someone else verify that that county commissioner who's tweeting from your county is themselves. You can tell because they're posting from the server owned by your county that only hosts official accounts that it's them. And what that means is that you can have something that looks a lot more like our current town structure, where you have public sidewalks and public parks and also private speech forums like universities or concert halls or even cafes. And it's not everything is owned by the government, but it's also not that everything is owned by one company or indeed that everything is private and owned at all.